You know, for some, this is one of the best MCU movies. And if you think so, you may even say it's legendary. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a brand new release, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it, and let's talk about Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This stars Simu Liu as Shang-Chi, the master of unarmed weaponry-based kung fu, who is forced to confront his past after being drawn into the Ten Rings organization. This is directed by Destin Cretton, who also co-wrote the screenplay, and it's the 25th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And with this being the first time we're seeing Shang-Chi in the MCU, it's an origin story for that character. Now, it's well known by this point that the MCU is noted for a lot of their films fitting into some sort of formula, even their more acclaimed films. Not every single one of them, but I'd say most of them, which works for tonal consistency purposes between films, but it does make them feel a little more of the same at times. Mainly their origin stories, which are basically a take on the hero's journey. And in some ways, this does follow some of the MCU formula, as it contains plenty of the usual humor, characters having to confront their past to become better people, and CGI spectacle to go all around. You can definitely feel it's a Marvel movie, though even with its references and connections to other films, it's not as overt here. So I wouldn't call this movie formulaic or generic. This definitely offers something different for the MCU, giving us a mix of martial arts and fantasy rooted in Asian American culture, and it offers a fresh spin on what's now known as the Marvel formula. Now, first and foremost, this is just wonderful on a technical level. The cinematography was pristine, and the score complemented both the action-driven sequences and character moments really well. But where it truly succeeds is the fight sequences. With this being more of a martial arts film, we do get a number of exciting moments of mainly hand-to-hand combat. The two moments in particular that stuck out the most to me were the sequence on the bus seen in the trailers, as well as a large fight on some scaffolding that was easily my favorite moment in the entire film. While they can still feel a bit bombastic with some CGI heavy stunts involved, like the amount of destruction caused in those fights, the hand-to-hand combat on display was great. The choreography was succinct and flowed smoothly, and it paid tribute to so many different styles of martial arts films. Cretton said that he was inspired by a number of different fighting styles, from the sleek, elegant movements of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which we see in a beautifully done fight scene towards the beginning, as well as the style of Jackie Chan movies, as seen in, say, the bus scene. And while none of the fights were done in one long take, there was still a number of longer running shots, with stunts primarily done by Simu Liu himself, that were not only just so detailed, but would help get us excited for what was coming next. So I was impressed there. And all these different styles flowed together well due to the impressive work by the stunt coordinator Brad Allen, who had worked with Jackie Chan himself. Though unfortunately, Allen also passed away recently, with this being one of his final films and dedicated to him. And to be clear, while the fights are a big part of why this does feel fresh, it's also worth noting that this isn't just some mindless action movie. It also acts as a character piece, with Shang-Chi having to grapple with the most troubled parts of his past, not just to stop the incoming danger, but to grow as a person as well. And Simu Liu is great here, bringing the right amount of nuance needed to make an interesting protagonist. When we first meet him, we can tell he's someone who hasn't fully shaken off his troubled youth, where his father trained him to be an assassin at such a young age, and he carries that trauma with him to the present day. But we also see he's not someone who broods and is overly serious at every waking moment, and we do see his warmer side out in the forefront as well, especially through his friendship with Awkwafina's Katie, which made for some of the film's funniest moments thanks to the fantastic chemistry between the two, who you can really believe as best friends. And Awkwafina was great as well here. It's basically her just doing the shtick she's known for, and if you're not a fan of Awkwafina in general, I don't think this is going to win you over. But for me, I enjoy her work. I find her to be very funny, and she gets a lot of really funny one-liners here. Plus, I also appreciated she gets a little arc of her own. Again, it does fall in line with the MCU formula about finding yourself and coming to terms with who you are, so it might feel a little familiar, but I do appreciate that they try making her character strong and not just some thankless comedic relief who's always just there tagging along. Though easily one of the best parts of the film was Tony Leung as Shang-Chi's father, Zhu Wenwu, who's also the real Mandarin, retconning the reveal in Iron Man 3 that Aldrich Killian was the Mandarin, even though it's a name this character isn't a fan of. And he's our primary antagonist, as the leader of the Ten Rings organization, which is this army that seeks massive amounts of power and who's been seen in some of the MCU's earlier films. But despite the setup that he's a character driven by power, that's not primarily what motivates him here. Instead, his big scheme is thinking he can bring back his wife, who was the one person who can ground him and who passed away before the main events of the film. And he thinks she's being held hostage in her old village, Talo. And that gives him such a compelling arc, and honestly makes him, hands down, one of the better MCU villains in recent memory. Even though he clearly has a ruthless side to him, he's driven by something more heartfelt than simple lust for power, which, to be clear, still does tie into some of the film's events. And it makes him more of a tragic character than just a pure evil villain. Even when he goes to recruit Shang-Chi and his sister Zhao Ling, played by Manga Zhang, while he has no qualms with dispatching them if they get in his way, we can see he really does want his entire family to be reunited. It doesn't justify anything he does here, but it gives him a much more emotionally resonant arc. I also like the way in which they injected some subtle social commentary into the character, specifically by tackling head-on Marvel's previous issues with the Mandarin in Iron Man 3, which some fans are still pissed about to this day. Because what this film did a very good job with is showing the importance of representation in film, especially through its tributes to other martial arts films, as well as to Chinese mythology, with the many fantastical creatures our characters come across. But it also gets a moment to address things like cultural appropriation and the issue of whitewashing in Hollywood, but it does so by specifically addressing one of the most divisive twists in the MCU by this point. And that's how Wenwu comments on the events of Iron Man 3, lamenting how Guy Pearce's Aldrich Killian needed to take what he did and pass it off as his own work, though by also mocking him and his culture with an insulting name like the Mandarin. So I liked how it managed to cover a lot of ground in that regard, addressing the controversial twist while also touching upon the importance of representation in film. So that added to the character's nuance overall. Now, while there was plenty this film did right, and I found it very entertaining, I'm gonna be honest and say I didn't necessarily love it. Now, I liked it for sure, but I do have some criticisms for it. And the big thing for me is that the entire last act brings it down considerably. And the main reason for that is, without getting too much into spoilers, is its use of CGI. I said earlier that there was a bit of an issue with even the more martial arts heavy stuff still having some bombastic CGI stuff going on, but in the last act, it goes all in on that. Like, to the point that it felt like much, especially because I thought it didn't look as solid as some of the MCU's other bigger effects. Like, some of it didn't feel finished, and it looked pretty obvious. But even that aside, I think for a film that really wanted to lean into being this tribute to all these different martial arts films and styles, to just pivot to being this over-the-top spectacle in the last act, it just felt unnecessary to me. In fact, there's a point where the characters have to reach a certain location, and it's about 30 to 40 minutes before things wrap up, and from there on, I thought everything was a little weaker than the first two acts, to be quite honest. For one thing, it does shift some of the conflict away from what we were building towards for the first hour and a half or so, and it introduces a few other last-minute elements that I felt weren't properly explored the way everything else was, and as a result, it takes this very deep personal conflict that was beautifully done up until that point, and it makes it feel secondary in some regards. And instead, we just get all these CGI effects and big explosive scenarios that makes it feel even more like a typical Marvel movie, which I felt they were trying to get away from for the first two-thirds. And I found that to be disappointing, because not only did it not look great, but it also goes on for way too long. Like, it's the longest battle in the entire movie, and you can definitely feel it. Especially since part of it is focused on last-minute story elements that we're just being introduced to, so it's nothing you're as emotionally attached to because it wasn't properly built up, and as a result, I felt like I didn't care as much. So I was disappointed there, and I get it, it's Marvel, it's superhero stuff, CGI spectacle does go with superhero stuff most of the time, but it just feels like they should have had more faith in everything else they were already building towards, like the practical martial arts fights and the deeper family-driven conflict. They should have had that drive the last act forward, because then it would have really stuck the landing for me. And truth be told, on top of that, I also didn't think all the characters quite work for me. Like, one of the henchmen is teed up as possibly having this bigger role, though really ends up being there just for show. There were characters who are introduced a little later on, or are meant to have some sort of emotional impact that I don't think quite hit as hard for me. And some of the flashback stuff could have been ironed out a little more in my view. I think we should have had more depth there. Like, I get that not everyone's going to have their own arc that's the equivalent of its own movie, but it felt pretty obvious that some characters weren't quite as thought through as others were. But for some people, the areas where it feels like the MCU is doing something a bit different here will feel like such a breath of fresh air that the criticisms might not be that big of a deal for them, because I know a lot of people do love this movie. Now for me, I enjoyed it for sure, I just think that those areas were a bit distracting. But I still liked it overall, and I do appreciate that while it ties into the grander MCU picture, it also works well as a standalone story, even with its explicit references to the other MCU characters and events, because that's something I know the MCU has been criticized for, where it feels like in order to appreciate one movie, you absolutely need to have seen all 20-something other movies beforehand. And that's not totally the case here, so I appreciate that. This works well as a good standalone story. But to be clear, it's still within this universe, so it still does offer us a nice tease of where things are headed, both for our characters as well as the MCU as a whole. And based on what we got, I gotta say, I am excited. Shang-Chi is another solid entry into the MCU. The film acts as a loving tribute to the martial arts genre with its impressive choreography, while also serving nicely as a solid character study, both in terms of its protagonists and its antagonists. While it does devolve into unnecessary CGI spectacle in the final act, with some story elements I didn't think were totally needed, it still does more right than wrong, being another emotional, funny, and overall entertaining adventure that works just as well for longtime MCU fans and for those wanting a good standalone superhero movie. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings gets a 7.5 out of 10. So let me know, did you see Shang-Chi, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Was this one of the better MCU films for you? Do you have a favorite martial arts movie? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.